Imagine you're on a plane with your closest friends, a weekend trip, a rugby match, nothing out of the ordinary. Then the turbulence hits. At first it's manageable, but then the plane drops, luggage crashes down from the overhead bins, you grab the armrest, knuckles white, heart hammering, and then silence. You're freezing cold, still strapped to your seat, sitting in a section of the plane that has completely broken away. You hit the earth, and somehow you're still alive. You don't know it yet, but you've just landed in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Mountains in every direction, no trees, no animals, nothing. You're alive, but you're going to get hungry. And it won't be long before your friend looks at you and says, "I'm going to eat the pilot." This is the survivor's story that eclipses all others, a tale of heroism, heartbreak, and decisions no human being should ever have to make. It's October 12th, 1972. A rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, 45 people total. Players, family members, supporters, and 5 crew, boards a chartered Uruguayan Air Force plane headed to Santiago, Chile. Flying commercially is too expensive, so they've gone with the cheapest option, a Fairchild FH227D. What they don't know is that this aircraft has a nickname among those who fly it, the lead sled, a nod to its heavy frame, weak engines, and troubled safety record. The first leg of the trip gets cut short. A brutal storm over the Andes forces them to stop overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The plane can't clear the highest peaks. It simply doesn't have the altitude. So the next morning they take an alternate route, a sweeping path designed to avoid the tallest mountains. It's now Friday the 13th. The mood on board is loose and fun. A rugby ball gets tossed around the cabin. One of the players, Nando Parrado, gives up his window seat so a friend can enjoy the view. He has no idea that small act of generosity will later save his life. Then the turbulence starts. At first, nobody's concerned, but then someone notices the mountains. They're right there, almost close enough to touch. What the passengers don't know is that the pilots have made a critical error. They radioed air traffic control saying they'd reach the airport in 1 minute. They were wrong. They were 11 minutes out, still deep inside the mountain corridor, nowhere near the point where they could safely turn towards Santiago. They descended anyway. The clouds parted, and the pilots saw a black ridge directly ahead of them. They pulled up, hit the throttle, but it was too late. The plane clipped the ridge, shearing off the rear of the fuselage and sending bodies tumbling into the mountains below. Still hurtling forward, the aircraft struck another peak, tearing off both wings. What remained was just the nose and the front section of the cabin. Then that fragment hit a snow-covered slope and began to slide. Down and down, somehow avoiding every boulder and rocky outcrop until it finally came to rest at 11,700 feet above sea level. Inside, seats had been ripped from the floor. People were thrown against the cockpit wall. Some were screaming, limbs broken, shards of metal embedded in their bodies. But they were alive, many of them, surrounded by unnamed glaciers so remote that no one had ever mapped them. And with night coming, temperatures were about to drop to negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Of the original 45 people on board, 12 had died on impact or been thrown from the plane. Nando was in a coma. 5 more would die that first night alone. The survivors did what they could. They blocked the holes in the fuselage with suitcases, huddled together for warmth, and told themselves that rescue was coming, that this was just one night. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that the plane's white exterior made it nearly invisible from the air. Search aircraft flew over the area and saw nothing. The next day they attended to the wounded. The co-pilot, the man who had made the navigational error, was found alive, pinned under debris. He told the survivors he had a gun and he asked them to use it on him. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. He died shortly after. Now came the hunger. At high altitude, in freezing temperatures, the human body burns through calories at a terrifying rate. They searched every bag on the plane. What they found: 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 jars of jam, some almonds, candy, and a few bottles of wine. For 27 people with no idea how long they'd be there, it was almost nothing. Days passed. More people died. On the 10th day, Nando came out of his coma and held his sister as she died in his arms. He later said he went to sleep and woke up in hell. Then came the moment that broke what little hope remained. Through a transistor radio found in the wreckage, they heard the news. The search had been called off. They were alone. No one was coming. It was at that moment that Nando looked at one of his friends and said, "I am going to eat the pilot." He wasn't the only one thinking it. One survivor later described it simply, "Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food." After just a few days, we were feeling the sensation of our own bodies consuming themselves just to remain alive. They didn't see it as cannibalism. They saw it as the only path back to their families. They started with the pilots, stripping the bodies of everything they could. It was grim, desperate, and it kept them alive. Then, on day 17, disaster struck again. In the middle of the night, one of them heard a sound like a stampede of horses bearing down on them. It was an avalanche. Snow exploded through the opening of the fuselage, filling it completely. Those still alive clawed through the darkness, digging for air, searching for friends. 8 more died. The rest were buried in silence in the dark for 3 days. When the snow finally melted enough for the fuselage to resurface, 19 people remained. They continued eating the dead. They made short exploratory walks, but the snow was too deep, the air too thin, and their bodies too broken to go far. Snow blindness, a literal sunburn of the eye caused by light reflecting off the glacier, threatened to blind them entirely. They fashioned makeshift sunglasses and snowshoes from materials in the wreck just so they could walk a little farther. "We felt like insects trapped in the hugest forces of nature," one of them said. They were right. On one of their scouting trips, they found the tail section of the plane. Inside, batteries, a little chocolate, some candy. For a brief moment, they thought they could wire up the radio, but none of them had the technical knowledge to make it work. Nando made a decision. They weren't going to be rescued. They were going to have to walk out. They knew Chile was to the west. The pilot had said they weren't far from their destination. What they didn't know was that they were still 37 miles from the nearest road. 37 miles of glaciers, crevices, and mountain terrain that would challenge even experienced climbers. On day 61, with only 16 survivors still alive, Nando, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicintin set out. Before they left, a man named Carlitos Paez had sewn them a sleeping bag out of aircraft insulation and copper wire. Without it, they would have frozen to death the first night. It took them 3 days just to climb the first mountain. When Nando reached the top, expecting to see green valleys and civilization below, he saw only more mountains, more ranges stretching endlessly to the horizon. Vicentin turned back to save food for the others. Nando and Canessa looked at each other. "We'll die," they said, "but we'll die trying." They kept walking. 8 days into their trek, barely able to stay upright, they found a river, and then something green, and then high on the other side of the water, a man on horseback. They couldn't cross. They screamed, waved their arms. The man saw them, but the river was too loud, too wide. He disappeared. That night, they slept on the riverbank. The next morning, he came back, and this time he threw a rock across the water. Tied to it was a piece of paper and a pen. Nando wrote, "We are survivors of a plane crash. We have no food. We cannot walk anymore. There are more of us in the mountains. Where are we?" He threw it back. The man rode for hours to reach the nearest village. On day 10 of their walk, day 70 since the crash, Nando and Canessa were finally pulled out by the Chilean army, their bodies skeletal, carried out on horseback. "I was ready to embrace life again," Nando said. Helicopters returned to the mountain. The pilots who flew them couldn't believe what they were seeing. The terrain these two men had crossed on foot, starving with no equipment. Years later, professional mountaineers retraced the route with modern gear and said it was hard, extremely dangerous. On day 71 and 72, the remaining survivors were airlifted off the mountain. Every single one of them eventually recovered.